Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Seminar in American Religion. My name is David Lantigua. I'm an associate professor of theology here at the University of Notre Dame. My colleague, Darren Dochuk, and I are the William W. and Anna Jean Cushwa co-directors of Notre Dame's Cushwa Center for the Study of American Catholicism. We're just gratified to see many colleagues and visitors today, and we want to extend a warm welcome to those of you who are joining the seminar for the first time. Thank you for being here. Twice each year, the Cushwa Center hosts the Seminar in American Religion to discuss a notable book recently published in the field. The topic of our seminar today is Dr. Lerone Martin's The Gospel of J. Edgar Hoover, How the FBI Aided and Abetted the Rise of White Christian Nationalism, which was published earlier this year by Princeton University Press. It's my pleasure to introduce our panelists here for this morning, beginning with our author. Dr. Lerone A. Martin is Associate Professor of Religious Studies and the Martin Luther King Jr. Centennial Chair and Director of the Martin Luther King Jr. Research and Education Institute at Stanford University. Lerone is a historian of 20th century American religion, focusing on the ways religion, politics, and race intersect to shape the American political and social landscape. He earned his PhD at Emory University and taught at Eden Theological Seminary before joining the John C. Danforth Center on Religion and Politics at Washington University in St. Louis, where he earned multiple teaching awards and served as director of the American Cultural Studies program. In 2022, Lerone was appointed the MLK Centennial Professor at Stanford. His award-winning first book, Preaching on Wax, the Phonograph and the Shaping of Modern African-American Religion, tracks the role of the phonograph in African-American religion, culture, and politics during the early decades of the Great Migration. He's received several nationally recognized fellowships in support of this work. To take just one example, in 2021, he was named co-director of the Crossroads Project, a 4-year multi-institutional project supported by a grant from the Henry Luce Foundation to advance public understanding of the history, politics, and cultures of African-American religions. Lerone has published articles and book chapters for numerous academic journals and edited volumes, and his commentary and writing have been featured by CNN, PBS, New York Times, Washington Post, NPR. There's been a lot of anticipation about this book and about today's seminar, so we'd like to thank you, especially Lerone, for joining us back, visiting us. We're fortunate also to have two excellent commentators to get our discussion started this morning, Darren Dochuk and Kristin Kobus-Dumais. Darren Dochuk is the Andrew Takis College Professor of History here at the University of Notre Dame. And as I mentioned before, the co-director with me of the Cushwa Center. He earned his PhD in history here at Notre Dame, and he's held research and teaching appointments at Valparaiso University, Purdue, Princeton, and Washington University in St. Louis, where he was a colleague, of course, of Lerone's at the Danforth Center. He returned to Notre Dame in 2015. Darren has taught and written widely on modern U.S. history, exploring connections between religion, politics, energy, economics. His most recent book, Anointed with Oil, How Christianity and Crude Made Modern America, was published in 2019 and was featured at the Cushwa Center's Spring 2021 Seminar in American Religion. His first monograph, From Bible Belt to Sun Belt, Plain Folk Religion, Grassroots Politics, and the Rise of Evangelical Conservatism, received numerous awards. He's edited and co-edited several books on religion and American politics, which includes Faith in the New Millennium, The Future of Religion in American Politics, and Beyond the Culture Wars, Recasting Religion and Politics in the 20th Century U.S. Darren's work has been recognized by the Society of American Historians, the American Historical Association, and his research has been supported by the National Endowment for the Humanities, the American Philosophical Society, the Rockefeller Foundation, and the Canadian government. So thank you, Darren, for being a commentator here with us. Kristin Kobus-Dumais is professor of history and gender studies at Calvin University. She earned a PhD in history from the University of Notre Dame, and her research focuses on the intersection of gender, Religion, Politics, and American History. After earning her PhD, she taught at Williams College and then worked at the Five College Women's Studies Research Center at Mount Holyoke College before going to Calvin. Her first book, A New Gospel for Women, Catherine Bushnell and the Challenge of Christian Feminism, was published by Oxford in 2015. Her widely acclaimed New York Times bestselling book, Jesus and John Wayne, How White Evangelicals Corrupted a Faith and Fractured a Nation, appeared in 2020 and was featured at the Cushwa Center's Fall 2021 seminar on American religion. So we welcome you back, Kristin, and she's currently working on a cultural study of white Christian womanhood. Kristin has written for the New York Times, the Washington Post, NBC News, and Christianity Today, and has been interviewed on NPR, CBS, and BBC, among other outlets. So again, thank you, Kristin, for returning. And for those who are new to the seminar, just a quick note on format. We'll hear from each of our commentators first, beginning with Kristin and followed by Darren. They'll have about 10 to 15 minutes to make comments, and then that'll be followed by Lerone, who will then conclude our opening part of this seminar, at which point we'll take a 15-minute break and then reconvene and open it up for question and answer. So with that, please join me in welcoming our first commentator, Kristin.
Thank you, David and Darren, for hosting this amazing Cushwa seminar. It's always a highlight to be here. And thank you as well to Kathy Cummings, who actually did a lot of the legwork a few months ago for this, and missing her presence here today. So much to say about this book, and if you looked at the back of the book, a little spoiler there, so you kind of know what I think. But I want to start with the foundations of this book, and that is the archival research. Church bulletins, private correspondence, telegrams, recordings, clippings, funeral programs, interviews, hundreds of contemporary published sources. When the back of a book contains a lengthy, and I quote, abridged archival sources list, you know you are in good hands. So what does all this research get Professor Martin? Conceptually, the book offers many important contributions. Now, I read an early manuscript. I'm not sure if I'm supposed to say this. But back then, the subtitle said this was a book about white evangelicals, not about white Christian nationalism. And then just before it published, I saw that it was now a book about white Christian nationalism. And I thought, of course it is. It was always bigger than a story about white evangelicals. Makes a lot of sense. And that's its strength, because it is about white evangelicals, but it is not only about them. It is also about Catholics, and especially Jesuits. It's about the white mainline and their declining significance. And it's about white evangelicals, but it is about how and why white evangelicals became so useful and so dominant in the larger story of Christian nationalism. And so I think this is an important book in terms of helping us better frame broader conversations about white Christian nationalism. One of the complaints you'll often hear is, do white evangelicals get too much attention here? They deserve it if you look at survey data, but Martin offers a model for how to understand and contextualize their influence, and even problematize their influence without neglecting the other strands. Now, having been a close observer and sometimes participant in recent conversations around white Christian nationalism, I think this book deserves a wider hearing, and I think if it can offer helpful correctives to what I fear are actually some of the problems with that discourse right now. A lot of the discourse is marked by a sense that white Christian nationalism is new. that it started in 2016, or it started on January 6, 2021, right? Everybody in this room knows that that is not the case, but historians are not the ones leading this conversation right now. White Christian nationalism tends to be ill-defined. Sociologists will offer some very neat and tidy definitions, but that is not necessarily what other people hear when they hear the term or what other people mean by the term. It means different things to different people. To some, it means Christian values should shape politics. What is wrong with that? In a democracy, everybody can bring their values into their politics. Is Christian America a bad thing? Is it a real thing? Or when we talk about white Christian nationalism, are we talking about Christian supremacy? Are we talking about white supremacy? Are we talking about authoritarianism? The end of democracy? And then, of course, what is white about white Christian nationalism? Martin's book brings clarity on all of these fronts. First of all, obviously, white Christian nationalism is nothing new. As Martin says, this is not a story of a faith being hijacked by political operatives in the 1970s, a claim that even well-intentioned but complicit white evangelicals often try to bolster. This is not hijacking. There's intrigue in this book, but hijacking is not one of them. This is a mutually beneficial relationship. That comes through loud and clear. Hoover's presence in the white evangelical world helped to authenticate the newly established religious movement as the rightful custodian of national morality and security. And a side note, evangelicalism is a lived faith, he insists, and it cannot be reduced to theology alone. Now, because of his detailed research in the historical sources, with respect to white Christian nationalism, Martin also reveals its operations on a day-to-day level. From sociologists, we have snapshots, right? We have snapshots that exhibit race and racism as a part of this constellation of values. White privilege, right? But to white Christians and to white Americans who do not feel personally racist, this is often a huge turnoff in the discourse and can actually push into further radicalization, right? But historians don't just describe or quantify. We don't just provide the snapshots. We show how the sausage was made on a very specific level. Here, Martin pulls back the veil on the mechanisms. We see Hoover writing over and over again for Christianity Today, right? We see the FBI printing and distributing Christianity Today articles. We see him ghostwriting countless evangelical sermons. We see Billy Graham channeling Hoover, and Gospel Light Publications that comes in, and Bill Bright and Campus Crusade and Erdman's and the Revised Standard Version, and the boss wants us to investigate Jesus Christ. What? For historians of American religion and of mid-century America, this is so familiar and yet so very weird, right? And that's the feeling I had over and over again. Shocking, yes, but not surprising. Now, again, this is mutual. Hoover's invited contributions to Christianity Today, Martin tells us, established him as a bona fide ally and accomplice of white evangelicals, even as his presence authenticated the upstart group of conservative white Protestants. The upstart group, that is very important here, right? This is creating the evangelicalism that we know today. His partnership bolstered the magazine's sales and prominence. In the process, he authenticated white evangelicalism as the rightful religious and political heir and custodian of post-war America. Hoover couldn't work with those crackpot fundamentalists or with the Trojan horse of the National Council of Churches, infiltrated as it was with communists and pacifists and labor and civil rights activists, right? Evangelicals fit the bill. Attention to the day-to-day mechanisms also answers the question over and over again, what is white about white Christian nationalism? And no shade to any theorists in the room, but we do not need CRT to answer that question as historians. by all means, use it if you like. It is visible everywhere in the historical records, if only you bother to look. And because Martin bothered to look, he gives us all eyes to see. We have Protestant Vesper services that were strictly for white bureau employees and their families and friends if they were white. The FBI had an unwritten policy against hiring Black special agents until a fair employment investigation twisted their arm, at which point Black agents were given particular ID numbers to identify them as Black without ever having to mention their race. Once Foundry Methodist Church was integrated, the Bureau never went there again. We know the KKK and the civil rights activists for Hoover were both unacceptable extremes. Civil rights legislation was not effective, according to Hoover, and of course the whole MLK surveillance story comes in. We see race all over in the story of white evangelicalism in this book. L. Nelson Bell plays a starring role here, open segregationists, and so much more. This is a story of Hoover and his all-white male Christian force of special agents. Now, this wasn't just workplace discrimination and run-of-the-mill racism, although it was that. Martin shows how Hoover created the modern FBI according to his own worldview, and under his watch, white Christian nationalism became the foundation of national security and of Americanism more broadly. So non-white Americans weren't just excluded from religious retreats and from jobs, they were cut out of the national identity. You do not need a theory to get to this conclusion, it is just based on the facts. Also, race and Christianity, the task to save the soul of the nation, Martin writes, went beyond theological particulars and biblical fidelity. Rather, the evangelical army also operated under the broader cultural norm of whiteness. Non-white evangelicals, people who shared these theological views, were excluded from the new evangelicalism. Deliberately and exclusively white is the evangelicalism that Martin presents us. Whiteness, he says, was the norm in their midst. It was an unmarked category that functioned as the organizing principle in the case of Christianity Today for the magazine and for the movement that it represented. He says whiteness was never questioned, named, or even debated during the formation of the magazine. It just simply was. And this is why it is so hard to talk about in conversations about white evangelicalism, about white Christian nationalism. And this is why the Federalist can review this book under the headline, Book Uses J. Edgar Hoover to Smear Christians as Racists. So the conclusion in terms of race is that this is not just white Christian nationalism is not just an innocuous kind of expression of Christian values. More blandly, it is exclusionary and supremacist. Speaking of exclusionary and supremacist, let's talk about gender. Here too, Martin gives us eyes to see. In the FBI, maleness was assumed, never questioned. Martin does not make that mistake. These are white Christian male agents, all of them. Women are excluded. Women of the Bureau were not to be heard save for the sound of their typewriters, he says. A wonderful section on the male physique as the canvas that displayed this all-encompassing spirituality. Muscular Christianity, where faith and physicality were inextricably linked. Only white men who exuded masculine norms could be true patriotic male Christians. So, it is only by gathering the extensive evidence that he has that he earns the right to make rather provocative claims regarding Hoover and white evangelicals. Hoover, he says, did not fit their theological profile. He did not believe in being born again, but he met with the more weighty requirements. He was white and male, performing militant patriarchal authority. Elsewhere, he says, whiteness and nationalism were the foundations from which modern white evangelicalism sprang. These are fighting words. Trust me, I know. But if you want to contest them, you have got to deal with the reams of evidence that he brings. There are so many more takeaways here, and I'll just touch on a few. One area that Martin touched on that I would have loved to see fleshed out a bit more was his observation of the role that Hoover played in promoting an anti-statist statism, anti-New Deal liberalism, but the power of the federal government, right? Limited government, and yet Hoover was the epitome of government overreach. Right, this is something that I should have done more with in Jesus and John Wayne. I hope to make up for it in the next book, and I think there is so much more that could be done in this case because it's such a perfect example and is one of these kind of disconnects in how people discuss conservative politics and conservative evangelicalism. Some other takeaways. Mid-century politics, it mattered little who was in office or which party was in control of Congress. And that's something that, when looking back, people often forget, kind of working with our contemporary categories. Also very important here, we see an incipient populism. On the one hand, Hoover paved the way for white evangelical conservatism, authenticating it as the only religious and moral vision for a secure America, yes. And on the other hand, Martin shows how many white evangelicals then bypassed their own pastors, their own religious authorities, and religious professionals. They preferred Hoover as the religious authority. So Hoover was the first evangelical outsider, he says, to become the movement's political, theological, and moral champion, but certainly he was not the last. Evangelical political ingenuity constantly searches and finds its political champion by any means necessary, and this pragmatic ends justify the means ethos is the very cunning creativity that led to the collaboration of Hoover and his FBI, and it remains a robust tradition within the movement, he claims. White evangelicals remain willing to compromise their stated morality and theology in exchange for the maintenance of whiteness and access to political power, all to bring America back to their God. As long as white evangelicals, he concludes, continue to ignore, forget, or refuse their history, they are doomed to repeat it. And the same goes for the FBI. Right? January 6th, we see the FBI dealing with a domestic security threat of white Christian nationalism. Martin says the Bureau's mission will be hampered if it does not trace the multiple origins and dwelling places and institutional expressions of the threat, even if that leads all the way back to headquarters. There is so much more that could be said, but I'm going to just close with one more very important point. This book has style. It is expertly crafted. It has the best opening line of any history book that I've read. You can look back if you don't remember it yourself. Also, Lerone, you're to blame for Franklin Graham moving the Billy Graham papers. Thanks for that. The style goes down to the sentence level. I'm just going to give you a few of my favorites. I have a whole list. I just started writing my favorite sentences from this book. White evangelicalism didn't jump the tracks. If we look at white evangelicalism through J. Edgar Hoover's stained glass window, the train appears to be running right on time. Another sentence, his grip on his saber was as unforgiving as his opinions. Another, the family's modest two-story stucco home was whitewashed, just like the neighborhood. Loving thy neighbor as thyself was easy for young Hoover. His neighbors were just like him. Hoover's Jeremiads were light on prophecy and historical accuracy, but heavy on political punditry. Hoover trusted God to keep watch over his men, but he also verified. I could go on and on. Like I said in my blurb, this book is rigorous, riveting, commanding, and compelling, and it is a privilege to discuss it with you here today.
Thank you, Kristin. What she said. It's not a challenge. It's a bit of a game here to anticipate what the other commentator is going to say, and I anticipated correctly. So she has done a lot of the heavy lifting here. So it's a real honor to be participating in Lerone Martin's SAR. This is a special seminar for many of us here, as he workshopped part of this a couple of years ago, so we can, in some ways, feel very much invested in this. This book certainly connects with me personally, which is why it's a privilege to offer reflections. Now, obviously, the book has lived with Lerone for a long time, haunting him, no doubt, both for the subject matter and for what it takes just to finish a book. This is how writing goes. But it's lived with me for a while as well. I remember its origins back when we were colleagues at the Danforth Center at WashU, 2013, 2014, I'm not exactly sure, but Lerone started to talk to me about this new project he was teasing out with the religion, the FBI. It was tantalizing. Every time I walked by his office, he was opening another envelope with some secret documents. I was just like, what's he on to? What are these leads that he's following? And it turns out that this was the foundation of the book that we read today. My life with the project did not end there. Even after moving to Notre Dame, I tracked its development. In fact, I served as one of the anonymous readers for Princeton University Press when it was under review. Anonymous no more. For more than one reason, I'm happy I had the chance to serve in that capacity. Always eager to do so, of course, for the sake of the Guild. An added bonus, though, is that when drafting these comments in the midst of a busy stretch, I had a cheat sheet of sorts. So cutting and pasting has served me well. I kid. I eagerly digested the finished book with fresh appreciation for what it accomplishes and really for what Lerone has accomplished, which is just remarkable, as Kristin has already said. Still, cutting and pasting would not have been too problematic, especially where highlighting the book's shining strengths is concerned. So many stand out. First and foremost, as we've already heard, the sourcing and scholarship. What a display of patient, careful, investigative journalism and academic prowess. A paste from the report, revealing my identity altogether. I don't even know if this is ethical, but whatever. Quote, Martin's research is stunning and on clear display in the notes, which document his deep dive into correspondence, memos, and data. His command of the relevant secondary material is impressive as well. Then there's the prose, another standout for me then, a few years ago, and certainly now. Quote from my report, Martin's book maps out the inner workings of the FBI and modern evangelicalism and takes a top-down approach when measuring the choices made and directions taken by Hoover and his most important Catholic and Protestant champions. But it also cuts to the grassroots to hear from the average Catholic and Protestant Americans who thought so highly of Hoover and who wanted to keep crusading for their white Christian nation. Martin moves through these altitudes of analysis with a deft pen and sharp recognition for the poignant and the important. He narrates crisply, and at no time does he leave his reader lost behind. But enough cheating. I could lift more whole sections from my report that single out smart features of the book, and then we would be done. Yet that wouldn't do justice to the finished product, which shines in other ways. The first quality of the published book I would highlight is its authoritative voice. I didn't have a chance to do a line-by-line comparison between the previous manuscript and the finished book. I intended to do so, but just kidding. My immediate impression after this read was that in his final months with the text, Lerone took complete ownership of it. There is no second guessing here. Countless sentences of my copy are circled in red because of their force. Of Hoover's centrality to evangelicalism's political errand, Lerone underscores, quote, statecraft had to be soulcraft. Hoover's faith served as the foundation of it all, a white Christian nationalism that wedded conservative Christianity and American statecraft. When post-war white evangelical conservatives heard the gospel of Hoover, they believed they heard the gospel truth. What stands out in the book version, secondly, relates to the first point. The boldness Lerone wields stems from an urgency that has been generated in collaboration with other scholars. As interlocutor and partner with a community of academic and popular writers, Martin uses his pen with clear purpose to expose the problem that plagues American society and American evangelicalism in particular, a surging white Christian nationalist impulse that has always operated at its center. In Hoover's buddy-buddy relationship with religionists at mid-century, Lerone locates a strand of white Christian nationalism, state-sponsored policing with an authoritarian at the helm that fueled violent reaction of all bloody kinds. In the name of an America First platform of white supremacy and patriarchal privilege, anti-communism and anti-liberalism, law and order and isolation from foreign others, Hoover and his allies in the pews found a way to remake America in their image, and the nation still feels the effects. Lerone is not the only one to write this tale with flashing warning signs on each page. Kristin and others have shouldered the same burden, and that is the point. Martin writes with an energy derived from a movement, and his book is better for it. He leaves us readers haunted too with the legacy of this man and his agency and the dark complicities between church and state that laid the groundwork for the fierce religious politicking of today and the tenuous political future with which we must all wrestle. Now, time is too short to signal other successes of this text. There's so many, and Kristin has helped flesh this out a bit for all of us. In the remaining minutes, I would like to ask Lerone to reflect more on his book. When writing my first book, a colleague told me, trying to reassure me, also urging me, just get it done. A book is never done, it is abandoned. I found that mantra liberating, allowing me to finish the task, but it also left me pondering things after the fact, including what was left on the cutting room floor and what needs saying next. Lerone's is a finished task, completed in splendid fashion, and leaving us to ponder some of its takeaways. I want to raise a few with hopes here of helping generate further curiosities and anticipating next steps in scholarship. Now, I'm going to do so with a framework that I always use, and it goes back to my evangelical preacher father, I'm sorry. And I just realized, looking at Rebecca here, I probably used the same sermon outline as I did speaking at probably this same podium a few years ago. 3 points in a prayer. There's not going to be a prayer, and the points are going to all be with alliteration, the use of alliteration here in the letter P. Incidentally, my father was an evangelical preacher, not a Hoover fan. So, but he was Canadian. So your thesis holds. You're okay. All right. Point 1, power, as in the tangled power and power struggle of church and state and the religious life of the FBI. As already mentioned, Lerone's is an exhaustive, scathing portrayal of church-state collusion in the age of Hoover. Both sides of this equation raise fascinating queries on their own, perhaps worth further consideration. On the state side, Lerone joins a host of political historians who have profiled single federal institutions in order to unpack the workings of the federal state writ large in modern America. Be it the Department of Interior or the INS, the Bureau of Indian Affairs or the State Department. In the spirit of the new political history that recently revived the genre, state agencies have assumed an agency of their own in the unfolding and retelling of political history. Their distinctive cultures, their personalities, matter when trying to make sense of Washington's trajectory through time. So too their infrastructures and operational reach, quirks, prejudices, and all. Such are the lessons individual pieces provide for the whole. More specifically, Lerone joins a handful of religious historians who have done their best to insert religion into the mix. Can a political agency not have a religious character of its own as well? Be it the armed forces or the CIA, the Pentagon or NASA, federal agencies have been shaped by faith and have shaped faith with real political outcomes, or so these historians say. Lerone's book is more proof that religion needs to be embedded in the history of statecraft. This despite what some skeptical political historians, perhaps Beverly Gage, might say. Yet I'd love to hear more about the religious underpinnings of the FBI as an institution. Obviously, one man looms large here, as he should. Hoover was like no other in his ability to force his personality on his institution. This is why the FBI could shun federal rulings prohibiting segregation. He made the law. Perhaps Lerone can reflect on the challenges of doing an institutional history of the FBI without getting swamped by biography. But I'm also eager to hear more about how the FBI as an agency exhibited its own unique religious character and made particular appeals to particular groups on the American religious landscape. Structurally, what made the institution itself so welcoming of particular faith commitments, and how, in turn, did its activities come to reflect such convictions? Some of Lerone's best work in this book comes early on, I think, in the book, when he probes such questions, but always with Hoover looming large. I'd love to hear more about the Catholicity of the FBI, its appeal to sacrifice in theological terms, and its sanctification of a patriotism that could guarantee belonging. In comparison, evangelicals seem drawn to the FBI through admiration for Hoover only. Yes, they seem to love the surveillance side of the equation, perhaps bringing their theological propensity for moral monitoring into the force. Yet their loyalties to the FBI seemed fleeting, their imagination slightly less stirred, certainly in comparison to their investment in NASA and the Air Force. Overstated likely, but the legacies of questioned loyalties may shed light on evangelicals' more recent willingness to question some institutional arms of the state, the FBI, while defending others. Random musings, the point being, how do different agencies of the state tap different theologies, different religious sensibilities, different devotional practices? What does that tell us about the state of the modern state itself, a purportedly secular entity animated by its own sectarianism? A related question relates to the church side of the relationship and concerns the struggle for power between religious communities as they vied for Hoover's blessing. One is reminded of Ronit Stahl's work on the chaplaincy, which shows how critical it was for religious denominations, marginalized ones especially, to petition successfully for their federal quotas in order to get their chaplains on the front and their status in Washington and the mainstream. The same type of jostling is evident in Lerone's book. One of the most fascinating dimensions of this story concerns Hoover's obsession with picking the right friends in the pulpits and pews. Reactionary fundamentalists, as much as left-wingers, had no place in his program, unless, as in the case of Carl McIntyre, they could sometimes do his dirty work. This highlights the role of pragmatism in the entire saga. Hoover and his friends all had agendas, self-interest, that took priority over principle. Power mattered most. Still, Hoover's vision for the FBI and its Lord's work was also framed within the parameters of the mid-century Cold War Judeo-Christian consensus. True Americanism at this time was to be a broad canopy of tri-faith cooperation. Broad, that is, as long as white conservative religious and political values were preserved. As such, Hoover happily recruited the National Council of Churches and mainline Presbyterians and Methodists to his crusade. But that alignment shattered quickly, we learn, as other marginal groups, Pentecostals for instance, eagerly stepped up to embrace the Hoover cult. Lerone's is a compelling case, yet I'd welcome more reflection on how and when this transition took place. In some sense, the shift seems sudden. On one hand, some evangelicals maintained a wariness for Hoover and the FBI due to its Catholicity well into the 1950s. This, as mainline Protestants, led by the omnipresent Reverend Edward Elson, continued to champion the boss's vision. Yet almost overnight, by 1958, 59, 1960 certainly, even as posh Presbyterian and Episcopal churches held FBI events, the FBI deemed the National Council of Churches a Trojan horse, evangelicals of Billy Graham's ilk allies. It did not take long or much for Hoover's ecumenism to falter, in other words, leaving one wondering what ecumenism existed in the first place, or what other unmentioned triggers led to the unraveling. And what of the Judeo in the trinity of tri-faith America? Hoover's was an agency that purported to live by rules of the Eisenhower consensus. Yet, but for a few Jewish G-men here and there, the dominant portrait is of an institution driven by white Christian men with little patience for anyone else. How did the FBI's formative role in the creation of white Christian nationalism draw steam from its anti-Semitism as well? Point 2, these are shorter going forward. P, protest, as in potentials, limits, and total absence. To be sure, the default mode of any review of an excellent published book can easily become, yeah, well, what about? In hopes of avoiding that tendency, I just want to raise a simpler open-ended prompt for discussion about the love affair all white evangelicals seem to have with J. Edgar Hoover. Hegemonic was the evangelical devotion to the boss. Lerone makes this case absolutely clear and convincing. You can't read chapters 5 to 7 and question it. In a sad saga like this one, however, the wishful thinker in me always tries to find moments of pushback, opportunities, some taken, for protest. They may not have existed at all, but Lerone concedes there were some small segments of white evangelicalism that did indeed critique the Hoover order, even if the dominant posture towards the boss was one of adoration. I'd welcome Lerone's reflection on those small segments within white evangelicalism that questioned or pushed back against the Hoover iconography or refused to endorse it so fully. How could they be evangelical amid such an onslaught of political support for the boss? What theological or cultural propensities allow them to take such a stand? Does such a reservoir of resistance against such bosses still exist today? Here too, I wonder about the parameters and descriptors Lerone uses. Who Lerone speaks of when he references an evangelical majority that saw Hoover as its bishop. What blurred lines of devotion emerge to the FBI and his doctrine when we extend the lens onto a slightly wider constituency of white, brown, black evangelicals circa 1965, circa 1970, or onto communities embedded in rapidly expanding and diversifying metropolitan complexes at the time, be it Detroit or LA or Houston, where increased interaction, say at megachurches or seminaries, international parachurch ministries or interdenominational gatherings, created opportunity for intellectual engagement as well. What happens when we decenter Christianity today in the story? Or what happens when we decenter Campus Crusade and profile InterVarsity Christian Fellowship and its global brand of white evangelicalism, one that tended to resist American jingoism, or at least tried? There's likely little space to open up here because Lerone's parting words on pages 265 to 266 and his appraisal of what truly is a dominant white evangelical mindset are absolutely convincing. White evangelicals always valorize the ascendant white male politico and champion of their Christian nationalist agenda. They themselves, as we see in the book, protest little when a leader like Hoover falls. As it did for Hoover, their Old Testament pragmatism dictates that they simply find another vessel for their interests, another voice for their demands. Finally, third, process. One final line of curiosity has to do with process and yet one more P word, pedagogy. The process that Lerone followed, indeed endured to bring this book to completion. So often at this seminar, we dwell on content as we should. The books we read and digest are always weighty ones that deserve such attention. Yet especially considering the audience comprised of graduate students, as well as of senior scholars with writer's block, I find it useful to think about how books are written and endured. With that in mind, I would appreciate hearing more about your journey, Lerone, on two fronts. First, it's clear that your research required some unusually heavy lifting, filing FOIA requests, suing the FBI, and waiting. How did this process play out, and what advice would you give others here who are hoping to access similar types of state-held files? Returning to an earlier point, how does one research well in order to bring the less visible characteristics of a government agency, its faith-related ones, to light? Second, looking back at my Princeton report after enjoying the book anew, I was struck by the changes you made in the last stages of revision, including in its title and opening sections, something that Kristin pointed out. In your manuscript, titled The Gospel of J. Edgar Hoover, the FBI and the Making of White Evangelicalism, you stress the affinity white evangelicals had for Hoover, for reasons that resonate in the book. Yet you also place more emphasis on his role in, quote, ushering the nation towards the religious right. The terminology is not much different overall. Religious right, white evangelicalism, no profound alterations, as both manuscript and book contain them. Yet as I pointed out earlier, the book's introduction hits much harder. As your revised book title indicates, this is a book about white Christian nationalism, not just pasty white evangelicals or a few loudmouths on the religious right. Yours is a story about a more systemic level of damning compromise that has corrupted religion and politics and endangers our society. So I'd like to hear about how you came to embrace the new terminology and the new tone. With what purpose and impact, and perhaps with what doubts. Thinking too about graduate students in the room, many of whom study evangelicalism, surprise, surprise, might you reflect on where, in light of recent turns in the historiography, I hear there's been some debate over the term lately, where they steered their scholarship, how writing about evangelicalism has changed and should change going forward if they're to get it right. Is the term even valid or useful, say when writing about Baptists and Pentecostals in 1950s suburban Atlanta, or about seminarians at 1970s Trinity Divinity and Fuller Seminary? Or is that soft peddling the essence of what these subjects really are, white Christian nationalists? I want to congratulate you, Lerone, big time, good friend and colleague, for writing such an exceptional, groundbreaking book. And I'll close with how I began my reader's report to Princeton. Quote, "I'll get right to the point. This is an outstanding book, and one that is sure to have immediate impact on the study of evangelicalism, political conservatism, white nationalism, and the religious right in the US. Underlined, I highly recommend its publication by Princeton University Press." So I am proud to have nailed it. Thank you.
It's always flattering and amazing and such a blessing when anyone reads your book, right? Besides mom and dad, right? And it's even more so when it's people who you have a great deal of respect from and those who you've learned from. So to have Darren and Kristin here is just, I'm overjoyed, and I'm very thankful because I learned so much from them over the years. So to hear them read my book and engage it has just been truly a source of joy. And also to be back here at Notre Dame where it's happening, where, as Darren mentioned, I was here in 2018, as Darren mentioned, in the midst of filing FOIA requests and lawsuits, and I gave a chapter here. We're still trying to figure out what the book was going to be. I got some great direction from colleagues here. It was nice to watch the department. You know, when you go visit somewhere, there's usually some type of debates going on within the department that you don't know exactly what's happening. So there was like some debate about what my book was about. I still remember that. You know, John had mentioned, this is a book about civil religion, and then others were like, no, it's not, it's about evangelicals, and so it was really nice to be here for that, and to show you all that I clearly figured it out, right? So let me respond a little bit to some of these wonderful points. I'll start with Kristin's comment about anti-state statism. I completely agree. I wish I would have done more with that this idea of this move on the right in some ways to really move us to believe that there's nothing the state can do outside of military force, outside of law enforcement, that other than that, there's nothing the state can do for human flourishing. And that we need to undermine in some ways the power of established institutions. I wish I would have done more with that because the FBI in many ways, I think, is the perfect agency, right, to make an argument about human flourishing and that the state can't really do anything, especially as it relates to welfare, social safety net. I think the FBI would have been a perfect institution to examine anti-statism. I stopped really at thinking about Hoover and his biography as an example of someone who's an anti-state statist. in that he rose to power because of a New Deal state apparatus, but yet he was constantly undermining the role of the federal government as it relates to the social safety net. So for Hoover, the only way really for America to flourish was for people to give their lives to Christ and become Christians, right? And the government's job was to really just restrain evil. And so there's a long theological tradition of that, I understand, and I wish I would have examined that more. I think it's probably worth an entire assessment in thinking about the actual construction of the FBI and this kind of ideal. And I really wish I would have done more with that. So I really appreciate Kristin saying that, and I hope that maybe we can have a conversation about that. Populism, I completely didn't even mention that in the book at all, and I think it's something worth us talking about today. What is populism? There's lots of debates about it today. What is Christian populism, right? What is populism historically? What is it now, today, in 2023, as we prepared for another election? I think that it's a really important question. What role has religion played in populism? I have been thinking about this a lot in my own personal life. I grew up in Ohio, not too far from here. Went to college at Anderson, not too far from here. And I was raised as an UAW child. I mean, both my parents worked in the automotive industry. The UAW meant everything to us growing up. The UAW halls where people got married, we had graduations there, so the UAW meant a great deal to me. So thinking about populism today and the labor strikes that are happening in this country, from Hollywood all the way to small town Ohio, I think is a great discussion for us to have. And I don't know much about the FBI's disposition towards this, other than the fact that during the Cold War, which will lead me to some of Darren's questions, anything that seemed too radical, Hoover would simply just label communist. And labor unions, of course, Hoover felt were filled with folks who were at least communist sympathizers, if not communist themselves. So I hope we can talk about that a little bit together collectively. Maybe some folks here are working on populism can help us with that. Some of Darren's questions, I think, in his wonderful 3-point sermon of power, I'll make sure I got the points right, that I was a good parishioner. Power, protests, and pedagogy/process.
Yeah, or process/pedagogy.
Process/pedagogy.
Just to be precise.
I will be at Bible study on Wednesday to get it right. I think that the Cold War is the answer, Darren, in some ways to your power question. I think I understood you to be asking me, like, what is the religious sensibility of the FBI as a particular agency? And why were evangelicals so attracted to it? I think the answer is the Cold War, in the sense that, as many of you know, President Eisenhower and others are constantly speaking this message that if America is going to survive this thing, literally survive, that we have to have a revival of a religious underpinning or religious founding of the nation. And I think the FBI is particularly suited at this moment because the FBI has been given the power from FDR to be the one-stop shop for all things domestic intelligence in terms of domestic and national security. So I think the FBI is really uniquely suited at this moment to be the agency that Americans look to for safety and to be the agency that America expects will keep it safe. It is the front guard. And I think this is what gives the FBI unique power, and also because Americans are told through popular culture that the FBI is all-knowing. There's television shows, there's radio shows, there's comic books for kids, there are G-Man toys. And so America is taught to believe that the FBI sees all and knows all. And Hoover wants that. He once says in the 50s and the 60s that he really wants people to believe there's an FBI agent behind every mailbox. Right? So this all-seeing eye, right, has a great deal to do with also with a kind of mythology around the FBI. And I think that's one reason why the FBI has such religious traction in America, because of this moment that the nation found itself. Protest, I really appreciate that, and kudos to Christianity Today for publishing some of the pushback that it received because of its relationship to Hoover. When I paid for my subscription for Christianity Today to get access to its archives, I was really happy to see they published a number of letters where people were very upset, saying, how can we be a movement of a particular theological identity, and yet we're publishing this individual's writings? And people from across the country wrote into Christianity Today. And to their credit, they published many of these essays. These people, I argue, were a remnant of people who were pushing back because they felt theologically that Hoover just didn't fit. How can we have someone speaking for us when he's never admitted to being born again? Billy Graham's journal had asked him more than once to give us your conversion narrative. And Hoover would just say, I was raised in the church. Right? He was a good old Christian nurture, if you will. And many people were upset about that. Others wrote in, they were upset about the civil rights movement and how Hoover was not moving fast enough on investigating church bombings and violent crimes against civil rights workers. So I call these people a remnant, and I think that I would argue there's still a remnant today of white evangelicals who have been pushing back on the current state of things in our country as it relates to evangelical faith and its connections almost exclusively to the Republican Party. I think there's still a remnant. I went to school with many of these folks. I'm still friends with many of these folks, and I still see it today. So I think that it's a small section in the book, very small, about this remnant of folks. I certainly could have done more, but I was really happy and excited to be able to point out that there was still a small remnant of people pushing back. As far as the process, yeah. I mentioned to Kristin last night that I requested the FBI file for the National Association of Evangelicals in 2020, sitting at home with COVID, not with COVID, thankfully, but sitting at home during COVID, and left with nothing but one's thoughts. And I was writing this book, and I thought, I never requested National Association of Evangelicals FBI file. So the FBI wrote back and said, we have a file, yes, but it's been sent to the National Archives. So you have to write the National Archives and ask them for this file number. So, and this is how the process works. So I wrote to the National Archives with the file number. Oh yes, we have that file. However, it needs to go through security clearance, and so we'll get it back to you in about 18 months. So I just received word this week that it finally received security clearance. So it ended up taking 3 years, about almost 36 months. So I have no idea what's in that file, but just to give you a point about the process, it can be extremely frustrating because of the game of cat and mouse you have to play, right? Most of us, when we go to our archive, there's this wonderful thing called a finding aid, right? Well, there's none of that with the FBI, right? You're kind of throwing stuff against the wall and trusting the FBI is going to tell you the truth, that yes, we have a file. If it's something that the FBI believes is exempt, they don't even have to acknowledge that they have it, right? So there's that balance you have to play. And then that game, and then, of course, if it's there, then the waiting game of security clearance. I had a great deal of frustration as it relates to the beginning of the book, as it relates to getting some of the files about the Jesuits and the Catholic worship services. Some of this information had been published years ago in a wonderful book called The FBI and the Catholic Church. So I knew the files were available. So I wrote to the FBI for these files, and they said that the files had been sent to the National Archives. So when I wrote to the National Archives for the files, they said they had to do security clearance and screening. And I said, this doesn't make any sense. These files have already been made public. by another author 10 years ago. And they said, well, that's the FBI's process. The National Archives, we have our own process. So I had to wait 18 months to get those files as well. So as Darren mentioned, when he was spying on me, ironically, walking past me in the office and see me wrestling with paper, this is what I was going through. So the process is extremely extensive, and it's very, very challenging at times to get documents. And then, of course, if you get documents and dealing with the redactions, things that have been redacted, people's names that have been removed. The one advice I'll close with, the one advice on this section, one advice I would probably close with is get an attorney. I was fortunate enough to meet someone who was a nice individual, a former Mormon. He teaches at Villanova Law School. His name is Tuwan Samahan. We met at WashU, and we were just kind of chatting, and he said, what are you working on? I told him what I was working on. I said, I made this request because Billy Graham had just passed away. I made this request for Billy Graham's FBI file, and the FBI just told me that they didn't know if they had anything, and they'd get back to me at some point. And he said, that's illegal, right? And I said, well, yeah, but it's the federal government, man. And like a good lawyer, he said, you should sue. And I said, what? And he said, I'll take your case. All you have to do is pay the filing fee for the court costs. And so, like a good assistant professor who's trying to get tenure, I asked my chair, Marie Griffith, if I could use my research account to sue the FBI. And she was like, let me get back to you on that. And so she went to the provost at the university at the time, who was Holden Thorpe. And Holden Thorpe, who's a chemist, and he said, well, there's really nothing in the faculty handbook that says you can't. So, sure. And I remember thinking, is this smart, Lerone? Are you going to get tenure? So I ended up using money, I think it was $750 to file the lawsuit, and then Tuwan Samahan took it on from there. And he's the one that really helped me understand this whole process, redactions, the law behind the Freedom of Information Act, and it was extremely helpful. For those of grad students who are here, most law schools will have a law clinic who will work with you on this for free, and just the students who are working on this area, intellectual property or state documents, that can be really helpful in helping you understand the law. Finally, the historiographic turns. I think Darren's absolutely right, and talking with scholars such as Matt Sutton and others, Matt wants to challenge us, and I don't think he's alone in thinking if the term evangelical is even useful anymore, especially when thinking about previous generations and the way that some evangelicals like to connect the movement all the way going back to the 18th century, for example, or 19th century. I think Matt wants to completely reject that. But I do think there's something about the moment that I write about, that the three of us write about. I think there is something special about that, and I think we can think about it institutionally. The formation of the National Association of Evangelicals, I think, is maybe one part where we could use the term and feel fairly comfortable with it. But I do think there's a historiographic question about if the term is even useful anymore. And maybe some might even argue that the term Christian nationalism or white Christian nationalism maybe perhaps is not useful anymore because of the way that it's been used. But I will close by saying I think that it's a term that if it's defined properly, and preferably by historians, I think it's a term that can be extremely useful and fruitful for conversation. And I hope after our break we'll be able to do that. I want to thank everyone for coming. Thank you all for going on this journey with me. It means a great deal that we have so many people of faith and different backgrounds who are concerned about this topic and what it's done to our country and how we can fix it. So I want to thank you all for coming and thank my colleagues for their comments. So thanks.
Wow, what a stimulating and fantastic set of comments here among those who are colleagues and friends to one another. What a privilege to be part of this conversation. We have about 10 minutes in our break here. Thank you. Before we begin by opening it up to questions from all of our guests and participants, I just want to take a few moments here. It's usually our custom during the seminar break to distribute here our American Catholic Studies newsletter and to share details. I'll be very brief about our next seminar. But I also want to take a few moments here to share a special announcement and give a word of thanks. As many of you know, J.P. Dolan, the founder of the Cushwa Center, passed away on May 7th this year in Salem, Oregon at age 87. Family, friends, colleagues gathered from around the country for the funeral here at Notre Dame on June 16th this summer. Darren and I began our appointments as co-directors just 2 weeks after that funeral. And virtually everything that the Cushwa Center has undertaken in the past almost half century has been, if not directly launched by Jay, significantly inspired by his vision. That all the directors after Scott Appleby, Tim Matavina, and of course Kathy Cummings have carried on in their own way, and that Darren and I have now inherited. All the center's future work, too, will always be part of this legacy, as well as the legacy of Charles and Margaret Hall Cushwa and the Cushwa family. In this room this morning, of course, we can see two specific things that Jay was very proud to start himself and to see flourish after he handed the center on to the successors I mentioned. One is, of course, this American Catholic Studies newsletter. And before Jay spoke about a center for the study of American Catholicism in the mid-'70s, he started writing the first several 4-page issues of this newsletter, soliciting a $2 fee from subscribers to cover printing and mailing costs. Within a few months after its first issue, the newsletter had already gained 300 subscribers. The enthusiastic early response convinced Jay to persist and to build not only a larger subscription base, but eventually, thanks to the Cushwa family, this whole research center here at Notre Dame. So looking around this room, we can see another testament to Jay's legacy, and that's the Seminar in American Religion, which is now in its 5th decade. When the Cushwa Center invites authors and commentators to the seminar, we describe it as our marquee event. Jay last attended a Cushwa Center event 8 years ago in September of 2015. It was actually a Hibernian lecture that was honoring in that 40th year of the anniversary of the center's existence. And at a banquet dinner, Jay told various stories about the center's early years, but he drew attention to one aspect that made him really proud, what he called a wonderful thing. And that's this seminar on American religion, which he said was not just about American Catholicism, but as we can see here today, right, it's about American religion, in which they would bring in leading scholars from all around the Midwest. It had began as just a 15 kind of person meeting, originally with Martin Marty talking on the topic of historiography, and now has grown into this today. And so, of the many accomplishments of his life, the Cushwa Center, of course, has held a special place in Jay's heart, and we know that he was especially proud of this seminar. And with that in mind, we've been looking forward to announcing that starting in spring 2024, our next marquee event, this seminar will be known as the J.P. Dolan Seminar in American Religion, to honor that legacy. So Darren and I want to personally thank all of you for being part of Jay's legacy by being here, to Professors Martin and Dumais for coming back, returning. And I just want to say also a word of thanks to all the assistants of our staff who've been, as they're known around here, the Dream Team, Madonna Noak and Shane Ulbrich for everything you do to make this possible. So thank you to them. thanks to all of you for coming, both near and far, from across the coast, from other countries, and from the South, the deep South, to be here. Thank you for that, and taking time out of your very busy schedules of your semester and your lives to just be part of this exciting seminar. We hope you can join us for the next event in the spring 2024 Dolan Seminar in American Religion. If you want to know what the topic is, it's actually this book here, Nonverts, The Making of Ex-Christian America by Stephen Bullivant. And you can learn more about it, the details on the back inside cover of the newsletter, which will be on April 6th. For now, let's return back to our discussion. And the way this will go is we have several assistants here who are going to facilitate the discussion by looking around. If you could just raise your hand, and persons with the mics can find you. And if you could just introduce yourselves as well, just who you are and maybe your affiliation or where you're coming from. Rob or Clement, our assistants here, will be able to bring a microphone to you to ask your question. Thank you.
Thanks. Peter Tucson from IUPUI. Lerone, this is such a fun book to read, but also a powerfully disturbing book, and in a good way. I mean, I think all history should disturb. And I mean, I have so many personal interests in this storyline and the subplots, and one of those subplots is the RSV Bible that I, of course, as you know, have long been interested in. And so I learned from your work, and it so surprised me and yet didn't surprise me that average people were writing in asking Hoover for advice on Bible translations. I mean, that's one of the absurd things in this book. But I'm particularly interested in the Protestant Catholic ecumenism here, the fact that Hoover eschewed the anti-Catholicism that is a through line through so much of Protestant history. And I don't think it's for any pure reasons, really, but the thing that brought them together was Americanism and anti-communism. And you have this powerful line toward the end of the book where you say, Hoover displayed how white Protestants and Catholics could work together as a force to save Christian America. They remain a formidable coalition to this day. And I mean, that's one of the lines that most haunted me in the book. I mean, they are a formidable coalition to this day, but what brings them together today? Because it's not anti-communism. I mean, is it a new form of Americanism? Is it race? Is it abortion? Is it a combination of things? I mean, if we look at Trump, I mean, I don't think that Trump really cares about abortion, and yet in Hoover's day, Hoover did care about anti-communism. So that's a difference. So I don't know. I just would be interested in your reflections on that.
Thank you for that. And Peter, as I mentioned to him previously, his work on this question about Bible translations was so helpful to me in writing. I think today that conventional wisdom would say that abortion is a huge issue that brings these two camps together. I think questions around marriage, I think as well, brings these two camps together as well, although the recent news about what the Pope has said, I shouldn't have said that name, clearly. I grew up Pentecostal, so I guess I'm not allowed to say that four-letter word. I think that individual has said some things recently that I think have upset some of the conservative Christian camp, I think, about questions around marriage. So I think abortion and marriage, I would see those as two issues. I'm not quite sure. There was a moment, it felt like concerns around Islam and the fight on terror, I think, for a while there. I felt like a moment with the FBI. There were some statements that were released and in popular culture as well, where you could almost have taken out the word terrorism and put in communism, and the sentence still would have worked. So I felt like there was, Sharia law and terrorism, things of this nature. I felt like there was a moment that was also bringing these camps together.
Thanks. Again, Lerone, thanks so much for this book and for the conversation. So I actually had a question that was very much along the line with Peter's, which is why I kind of jumped at the chance to ask it, because in looking at the kind of, there's in the discussion of Christian nationalism, there's a discussion of it being as an interfaith movement, right? I'm thinking about the Uncivil Religion Project down at the University of Alabama that just looks at the panoply of religious iconography in the January 6th uprising or riot. And as I was reading, the sort of the thrust of the manuscript for me was Catholics appear in this book primarily by their ideas and their devotional activities, right? If we think about the spiritual exercises of the FBI, and then evangelicals show up by their organizational networks, right? In terms of working with them in that way. And I'm wondering if that reveals something about the nature of Christian nationalism in America in terms of where ideas come from and where activities originate, because that's often, that evangelicals often need Catholic intellectuals to get things done is sort of the joke that's often made. And I'm wondering if you're identifying the kind of origins of that coalition here, or if there's, if there's other reasons that Hoover didn't feel he could work with, the Catholic Church in the U.S., but relied upon its ideas, but could work with evangelical organizations. And I'm just curious if I'm reading that right.
I think you're giving me more credit than I deserve, but that's a really insightful. So yes, I did request FBI files for Catholic law schools, so like St. Louis Jesuit, specifically St. Louis University, Fordham, just to see if I could get anything on the recruiting practices. So in that sense, there was Hoover relying on those institutions. He felt like Jesuits made really good FBI agents. But I think you're right. I think his concern within America at the time as being deemed Catholic. So he was very, very concerned, and he would give public speeches around, I'm a Protestant. He would say it a lot throughout his speech, but I affirm everything you all are doing in the Catholic Church, and your model, the parish system. He really, really, really affirmed all of that. But he was also terribly concerned about people thinking he was Catholic, and so when these accusations were being thrown at him across the country, he pushed back against that. So I think your insight is correct, that because of that, he would work with their ideals, but it was a little more iffy about their institutions, other than when it came to like the devotional practices, as you mentioned. And then I would say the institutional aspect would be in the recruiting of from Jesuit law schools. And even on a personal level, he had this really close relationship with a Jesuit priest who led a great deal of the opening prayers at the FBI National Academy. He was very close to him when his mother passed away. There's some letters between the two of them I found at Georgetown, where this priest was really spiritually shepherding him through this moment of grief. So on a personal level, yes, but you're right. I think the institutional level, it's a great point. Probably other than the law schools, he would stop from there.
again, I really enjoyed this book, and I have so many things that I really enjoy about it. One particular question for now. So I've been especially thinking about how the making of these Christian FBI agents is coming in a moment, as you mentioned, that churches, especially the Catholic Church, are investing all vocations with all this spiritual meaning. Mm-hmm. And that it's not just the spiritual mission of the FBI agent. Every single job, Matthew Pell writes about this in The Making of Working Class Religion, like all these various types of jobs, including UAW jobs, are like very heavily invested with spiritual meaning. And so I've been wondering what you think of that in that context. And I don't have a good answer. I want to know what you think. Like, is this part of the heresy of white Christian nationalism or white Christianity? Like, is this a heresy that we're investing so many jobs with meaning that are not sort of checked out in their fullness, in their long-term implications?
I'm going to ask you to join me on this. I saw connections that Hoover made through his Reformed tradition as a Reformed Protestant of also thinking about work and a job as being a part of one's Christian faith. And that, so I don't want to put that solely at the feet of Catholics. I think there's a good deal of Protestants from Hoover to Martin Luther King Jr. who would have thought about no matter what occupation one was in, it was a calling and a vocation. And so you did it with God and for God, right? And how you did it was an expression of your faith. I mean, so I see that within Hoover's Reformed tradition, but even a kind of liberal Protestant Baptist like Martin Luther King Jr. So I'm gonna.
Yeah, very briefly, I would say I'd want to draw some distinctions between religious meaning in work, what kind of religious meaning, even Christianity, what kind of Christianity, and if we're going to make the leap from religious purpose to is this white Christian nationalism, I think we'd have to look for a couple of different things. One is at the heart of Christian nationalism is an exclusivist kind of us versus them mentality. There's always this line of if there's an enemy, there's a threat, and so some are with us, some are against us. Which is not necessarily, and in fact often not the case if we're just talking about religious purpose and vocation. And then also right the nation, the nationalism part, right? What we're seeing in this book and in terms of white Christian nationalism generally is like the idea of both us versus them and the role of the state, right? This is Christian America. And so some are rightful heirs, there are real Americans, and then there are others. And those are two ingredients that I think we would have to see to link this to white Christian nationalism, which isn't to say there isn't this broader trend going on of looking for religious meaning, purpose, in vocations at that time, although I'd be interested to see if that is somehow a new development or a rising development, or if it's just how it manifests in this moment, particularly in the Cold War context.
That's a great point. Great point.
I'd like you to respond, though. So in response, you've written on labor.
Absolutely.
I mean, Catholics, placing their labor activism in the 30s in the context of a spirituality. So, I mean, is that a natural translation into white Christian nationalism? So.
Yeah, I mean, I don't have a good answer. This was very provocative in asking the question. I think there's a danger of investing spiritual meaning with every vocation, and I think you're pointing that out in a really interesting way. And I think that there was a reason for that, and we know that history, or some of us know that history, but I think I like the way you're emphasizing that as this is what happens when you invest all vocations with spiritual meaning.
Hello? Okay, it was working. So I'm curious. Your book is making me think of Michael Graziano's recent book on the CIA and Andrew Monteith's recent book on Christian nationalism and the rise of the war on drugs. And my broader question is, do you see your book as part of this turn towards seeing religion within these ideas of policing and the national security state? And what is the implication of perhaps expanding that line of inquiry?
I do. especially around moral policing, but also as it relates to how state agencies go about and do their jobs, and how they, with certain normative ideas, adjudicate citizenship, adjudicate ideas around correct practice, good religion versus bad religion. And I've thought about this recently, I think, with some of the headlines in the news, as I see how certain religious practices are getting grouped together with criminal activity. I've seen in the news with some of the RICO cases coming out of Georgia, not President Trump's, but some other RICO cases in Georgia, where one's religious practice is being used as part of as a character witness to say that, well, this individual engages in religious sacrifices. So therefore, they are backwards, they are not modern, they are deviant, so forth and so on. So I do think that it's important for us to think about all state agencies, as Darren mentioned, but I think especially in law enforcement. Aaron Griffith, I think, is taking on this work now. After his book, God's Law and Order, he's now looking at, specifically looking at policing. So I do think that this is a moment where we're rethinking the war on drugs and law enforcement, historically speaking, to try to help us understand how we got to where we are today, and maybe perhaps some solutions moving forward.
Hi, I'm Jean Petit, Hope College. We talked very briefly last night about this weird moment with the FBI, that the left is kind of defending it, and there's attacks on it. It made me think, like Kristin talking about anti-state statism, and your point about how Hoover shaped the FBI to be this all-seeing eye. And I'm wondering, I'm just curious of your current day reflections to say more about that. Is it kind of turning on itself? Like, the FBI is not diversified, right? Really, not or maybe a little, but it still has a lot of those qualities, and now their people are kind of turning on it in this kind of anti-deep state moment, and it feels like it's just kind of collapsing on itself, but maybe not, but I'm just curious of your ideas about that.
No, Congressman Jim Jordan from my home state, Ohio, has been leading this effort for Republicans and conservatives to defund the FBI. It's a very fascinating moment, and I think in some ways, for some liberals, I think my book is inconvenient, because in the Trump moment, FBI, many liberals look to the FBI to be the hero of the story. And conservatives, flipped. And formerly it was, liberals who felt the FBI was too far, and conservatives supported it, and now it feels that it's reversed. And ironically, Jim Jordan, in his report I read about defunding the FBI and how the FBI was purging itself of conservatives, he actually cited the FBI's campaign against Martin Luther King Jr. as an example of FBI overreach. But I think the irony of that story is that, as I try to argue in the book, it's the kind of Christian conservatism that led to the campaign against Martin Luther King Jr., which on Tuesday, October 10th, will be the 60th anniversary of the FBI beginning that campaign, when Robert Kennedy signed off on the memo on October 10th. So, I mean, it's a very strange moment, I think. For some, this book is kind of inconvenient, I think, because people want the FBI to be the heroes in the story today. And your point is absolutely right. The Bureau, in some ways, at least demographically, looks very similar, demographically speaking, that it did during Hoover's day. And I think that it still struggles, as January 6th showed us. I think it still struggles with how do we go about policing and preventing white nationalist violence. There is a legislation that's been considered for quite some time, the National Domestic Terrorism Prevention Act, that would give the FBI more power, more resources to try to stop this rising trend of white nationalist violence. And I don't think, and there's a great deal of Democrat support, I don't think that that's the answer. I don't think a very powerful FBI needs more power. We know now that they knew ahead of time that violence was going probably to occur. They had, at January 6th, they had a high number of informants within the Proud Boys, and yet and still January 6th happened. So I don't think the Bureau needs more power and money. I argue it just needs the commitment and will. And I think some of our elected officials need the commitment and will to stop what's going on.
First of all, thanks for a great book. Thanks for amazing comments. I'm John McGreevy from Notre Dame. Let's maybe, and this is for the whole panel, let's try and reflect on potential analytical distinction. Here's the question. Is there a difference between Cold War patriotism and white Christian nationalism? Is there a difference between Cold War patriotism and white Christian nationalism? The tenor of the comments would suggest no. Okay, but let me spin out a narrative where maybe we could make a distinction. We'd say Cold War patriotism was deeply statist. Some dimensions of white Christian nationalism are anti-statist. We'd say Cold War patriotism was profoundly international, corporate, State Department, political. White Christian nationalism, more isolationist, certainly in its contemporary manifestation. Cold War patriotism had a rhetoric of colorblindness. I know that's not the reality, but it had a rhetoric of colorblindness. White Christian nationalism does not have that rhetoric. Cold War patriotism was deeply Christian at the level of the Supreme Court, where even liberal justices are saying this is a Christian nation.
Right.
But there was something different between that. I think there's something different for that broad Christianity and Christian nationalism.
Yeah.
So that's the question. Can we draw an analytical distinction between Cold War patriotism and white Christian nationalism, which gets at the title of the book and the arc of the argument?
Yeah.
If we could draw that distinction, would the second question be, okay, when does contemporary white Christian nationalism begin? That is, historians are about periodization, they're about beginnings and endings. We probably wouldn't say it begins in the 18th century or it begins, what is I think sometimes of Sam Moyne's work on human rights, where he really pushed to say, okay, the human rights movement actually begins in the 1970s. Don't look for the antecedents. That's not particular enough. Historians have to say it's the 1970s. I don't know what we would say about white Christian nationalism, but if we can make that distinction, if you'd accept that, and you might not, then we'd have to ask that next question. So broadly, is it worth it making a distinction between Cold War patriotism or white Christian nationalism, or do you really fundamentally think they're the same thing?
I think we should start from the left.
No way, this one's on you. It's a great question.
It's a great question.
And in some ways, partly the comments I offered too was for you to unpack that 1950s moment, especially because we do see certain trends unfolding that might be interpreted as going against actually what you're arguing.
No, I think that's absolutely right. So I do think there's a difference. I do. I think that Hoover was always a Christian nationalist, and I think the Cold War simply allows him to engage and deploy his politics that he always had prior to the Cold War. So he's thinking this way in the 30s, right? And then by the time the Cold War rolls around, he says, well, we needed in the 30s to stop the rise of the gangsters like John Dillinger. We needed a revival. And that's what's gonna help us survive the communist threat as well, a revival. So I think Hoover always had these commitments. I do think there's a distinction. I think when, similar to today, I think when a liberal Supreme Court justice says this is a Christian nation, I think he means something different than what Hoover means. But I think when Hoover hears it, I think he hears his understanding of what that means. And I think we see that a lot today, right? I think people are speaking past one another, even though they're drawing on the same terms and myths and symbols. I think they're deploying them in different ways. So that would be my answer to that question. I think the Cold War sets the table and allows Hoover to deploy his politics in a way that maybe he couldn't have done in the 20s had he, been head of the FBI earlier. When does it begin? I mean, that is the great question. There's books that are coming out now that are arguing, the origins of American religious nationalism, a new book out about the history of church and state. I mean, I'll be safe and stick to the century I know the best, that's the 20th century, and I think that this modern notion, I do think it starts, I want to date it to around the 30s, with people being concerned about the Great Depression, the rise of a big federal state apparatus, are pushing back. Probably, Sarah Hammond's argument, Kevin Cruz's argument, that there's something about this moment with the Great Depression that corporations are concerned and start investing in this idea that this unfettered laissez-faire capitalism is the best expression of a Christian faith. And from there, we get this draw that if we're going to be a Christian nation, we got to have a limited government as it relates to economic activity, as it relates to integration, right, as it relates to other issues. But when it comes to morality, we need a big state apparatus to enforce a certain kind of morality. So I will argue for that moment. Now I can turn to my colleagues.
I mean, I'm sure Kristin has much more informed insight here. I mean, I agree. I think with the question, as I said, I think it's a more tangled reality in the 1950s. In retrospect, certainly roots of a white Christian nationalism can be found there for reasons Lerone highlights. At the same time, this canopy of Judeo-Christian political initiative is in many ways, it's a fractured one, but it's also remarkably effective in rallying a nation across lines of identity, right? And it will fracture quickly by the late 50s. I think this is what Lerone shows even in Hoover's relationship with the National Council of Churches. But for that moment, I think it's a little bit more problematic to impose so forcefully a label of white Christian nationalism. Now, I think, and one of the books I really appreciate is Healing Gaston's book on Judeo-Christianity, the notion of a Judeo-Christian nation, which is, again, the Eisenhower Project. It's the mid-century. It's not just Eisenhower. It's a 1930s, 1940s project, which is envisioned, however problematic, however prejudiced, as an inclusive endeavor, right? It's of course inclusive for military gain, of course, internationally. Nevertheless, philosophically, it's got plenty of room for negotiation, integration, and that concept itself, that label, does by the 60s and 70s get co-opted by the right, so that by the 80s, that very notion itself is a conservative notion. This is a protection of a particular kind of nation that is heavily racialized, that is heavily attuned to particular conservative values. So what was, and I don't want to romanticize it, of course, but what was a moment perhaps of broader conceptualization is within a number of decades, a few decades, a very different understanding, and that is, of course, a label that evangelicals will take with them into the 90s and 2000s as theirs. It is justification for why this nation is theirs as custodians. And again, you can map the trajectory, I think, more broadly of white Christian nationalism alongside that.
But the fascinating thing, though, I think you're right, but the Make America Great Again idea from Reagan in the 80s and then Trump again, if you were to ask them the question, when was America great? Many of them would point to this mid-century project, right? That's the irony, wouldn't you say? They would point to the 1950s and say, that's when America was great, because they would say that's when men were men and right? Leave it to Beaver America. Like that's the interesting moment, right? Even though we recognize that 50s project was different in many ways than the way that it's being deployed by folks, the evangelicals in the 80s and 90s, right? Wouldn't you
For
say?
sure. No, and I'm all for irony. That's what, irony is what drives my writing and my life in general. So yeah, for sure. What I'm highlighting tentatively is a romanticized vision of America that never existed, and that would be easily tapped for political gain later on. And you're right, it's skewed heavily. Nevertheless, I think there is something that people of all backgrounds could latch onto in the 50s. That was a dream, that was a vision that had potential. And that potential quickly went away. And of course, as historians looking back on that, we see that potential was never really that great in the first place. So,
yes, to this conversation, and in fact, Lerone, when you mentioned that John years ago had posed the question, right? This is a book about civil religion, or maybe it wasn't a question; it was a statement. And I think we're tapping into that bigger question. And so I would say I do not think that white Christian nationalism and Cold War patriotism are one and the same. Although I would say that this white Christian nationalism that Lerone kind of spells out in the context of J. Edgar Hoover and the FBI is perhaps a dominant, if not the dominant strain of Cold War patriotism. Right, and then that color blindness. You draw these distinctions, a number of them, and I mean the international versus isolationist is a really interesting one to think about too. But the color blindness is worth unpacking more, and what you're suggesting, right? There is this idea that it is a more inclusive endeavor. It is a that you can find, if you are not white, find a place in this, and that's where we could look at, something that sociologists will show us with their rubrics, that Black Protestants score very high on Christian nationalist surveys, right? That's true. But then what is the difference? And again, I would go back to the inclusivist versus exclusionary vision definition of citizenship, of who is a true American, right? And then when did it start? Again, it gets so complicated because you can go back to the late 19th, early 20th century. How did race function in understanding of what it was to be American very prominently? Right, and in terms of American militarism, and we could talk Teddy Roosevelt and Spanish-American War, and this, and so it's a very complicated answer, or question and answer, but also very important because of the ways that the conversation is being had today, which do conflate and obscure these important distinctions, so that people are saying one thing, hearing another thing, and this is contributing to the polarization and the radicalization and people speaking past each other. So I think this is a real problem.
And let me just say that I realized I didn't answer another question about the title of the book, and I think this, right? Because I think when I came here, it was thinking more about white evangelicals, but it was in coming here, and when you made the comment about civil religion and then some of the wonderful comments from the graduate students, it was like, well, you gave us a chapter, Lerone, on Catholics, but the book is called about white evangelicals. So I think that even got me thinking, this is a bigger story that does involve a mid-century kind of Judeo-Christian America, tri-faith America. So this conversation is what got me going and changing the title, which of course is what brought us to this wonderful question.
Hi there. Thank you very much for the book. Dennis Weibel, JD, PhD student here. I think my favorite chapter in the book was chapter 2 on soldiers, because in many ways, before I was here, I was at Boston College, so learned a lot from Jesuits. And one of the terms while I was there that I heard probably more frequently than anything else, besides Go Eagles, was about formation. And your second chapter really talks about the different ways that the FBI as an institution formed its agents, and how leaders in the FBI were themselves formed in some ways by Jesuits and by other ideas. So I'm just wondering if you could say something about the experience of studying formation. In your book, we see how formation can kind of go wrong, but there are also ways that formation can go right. Absolutely. And a lot of institutions, Notre Dame being one of them, takes pride in the way that you form students, and institutions form their members in many different ways. So I'm wondering if you could say a little bit about the process, and if there's anything you learned in the course of thinking about formation in ways that it can go wrong, or maybe we can make it go right.
Well, the first thing I learned was how attracted I was to it, personally. I was raised Pentecostal, and so this kind of regimented, formalized spiritual practice was very attractive. Like, I was like, I like this. I was reading books about the spiritual exercises, read the spiritual exercises, and really found it beautiful. But I read a book by Lauren Winner about how ritual can go wrong and how practices like this can be deployed not for human flourishing, but for domination. And I think that's what I was thinking about when I read the spiritual exercises first, and then I read books about people talking about formation and ritual that made me think about how this was all going bad. So there was a part of me in writing this that was like, damn it, how could you do this, Hoover? Because I found it so personally appealing, to be honest. Yeah, right, sign me up. So, thank you for your question.
Hello, I'm Susanna Destradis from Mississippi State, but also proud Notre Dame history alumna. Lerone, it's wonderful to see you again, and it's wonderful to be able to claim to have been, played a small part in this project as when you came here, as you mentioned, in 2018, and workshop what was then a chapter on the stained glass window. It's just wonderful to see the finished product and to be able to discuss it. I was going to return a little bit to the question of, this being Notre Dame, right? The question of Hoover's relationship and fascination for the Catholic Church. And I was wondering if you could elaborate a little bit more on change over time in this fascination, right? In this relationship. Obviously, you described very beautifully how mutually beneficial it is, how what a splendid convergence it is for Hoover and for Catholic officials. And I guess my question, or at least the 2 points that I would want you to elaborate a little bit more on are two. First, the fact that Hoover's contacts and close relationship to Catholic Church, and I would say not just Catholic individuals, but also the institutional church, right? Like very visible leaders such as New York's Cardinal Spellman, but even the Vatican representative to the U.S., right? The very Italian Amleto Cicognani. Hoover was unsolicitedly sharing his speeches with the Vatican's representative in the U.S., right? So, but this happens in the 30s. As some of Hoover's earliest declarations of, the Catholic Church being, I'm a Protestant, but the Catholic Church seems to be like the only institution that can save America. And it does so in the 30s and 40s when Catholics are still pushing the enemy within line because they're uneasy with what's going on in terms of World War II and the alliance with the Soviets, right? So Catholics are being a little bit slightly countercultural in the early 40s in that respect, right? Because they are keeping the focus on anti-communism when other religious groups are not necessarily doing it. And so Hoover sees in the Catholic Church where they get it. They get that the Red Scare is not over. They're not being blinded by the World War II exigencies. So I'm willing to go a little further and say, yes, I'm a Protestant, but the Catholics, they're the ones. And then by the time we reach the heyday of the narrative, by the 60s, you talk a lot about how, the thrust of the book is basically Hoover makes evangelicals the guardians, right? Like, he anoints the evangelicals, he allows for their advance to the role of guardians of Christian America over and against the mainline Protestants, right? And obviously you talk a lot about that, how, the NCC is just becoming infiltrated and all of that. Does Hoover elaborate on evangelicals versus the Catholics at that point? And if so, is he doing it because the Catholic Church is also home to the Berrigans, right? And to a different, it is becoming a little less reliable as an institution, right, than it used to be in the 30s. And again, this is just a couple of thoughts, but any thoughts you have or ways you want to elaborate on that, I would be.
Yeah,
Thanks.
I really appreciate that. I should have been more explicit about that. That Hoover starts to say, like, I'm not sure about this institution anymore, and this new group of evangelicals, he's being advised by agents who say, like, this is the group we should partner with. And I should have been explicit to say about his feelings about the Catholic Church. And you're right on as it relates to the Berrigan brothers, especially with the Jesuits. There are some Jesuit priests, especially the ones that Hoover has come to speak to his agents and lead them through the spiritual practices. They write letters to him saying, hey, look, the Berrigan brothers, they don't really represent us. Like, we're down with you. We apologize for those guys, right? They're off on their own. So I should have been more explicit about this change over time, because as you know, that you start having Catholic priests who are participating in civil rights protests, Catholic priests who were present in 1963 at the March on Washington, which leads Hoover to believe that King should be surveilled. So there is this sense that he doesn't quite trust the institution as a whole as much anymore, but more so certain Catholic priests that he will trust, but not the whole entire institution as a result of some of these changes that you mentioned.
When I got to the last chapter, I really wanted another 200 pages.
Oh, yes.
I apologize for saying this, because you finished the damn book. This is good. We celebrate that.
Well, as Darren said, it was abandoned.
Yeah, it was abandoned.
Not finished.
One little piece at the very end really intrigued me. I'd like to hear you say something a little bit more about it, and that is, in the post-Hoover era, the FBI's affiliation with religious institutions seems to have taken a shift. And you just spoke somewhat about that, about its changing vision of Catholicism, but all of a sudden, at the end, we have Westboro Baptist Church pastors talking at FBI events, and Pat Robertson showing up. And I'm wondering if there is a trajectory in the post-Hoover era towards more and more conservative Protestants.
It's a great question, and the FBI file on the Protestant Vesper services ends in the late 70s, early 80s with Pat Robertson, and this long report. My dear friend who's doing the JD PhD would appreciate this. There's a long report from the General Counsel of the Department of Justice that starts telling the FBI, you can no longer use appropriations to pay for this worship service. And the FBI goes back and forth by saying, well, look, this is for morale. And the General Counsel says, no, morale would be like paying for speakers in the lounge, or morale would be like having some type of gathering, a potluck or something. But you cannot use your appropriations to pay for these preachers to come. So the file kind of ends there. So my assumption is that these worship services take on a more sort of volunteer, unofficial FBI activity. And I was confirmed in that. And recently in Chicago, the FBI field office, for the first time in several decades, did not have a Catholic priest come to the FBI headquarters for Ash Wednesday. And it was a really big deal. But agents were still allowed time off to go to the parish, actually, and for Ash Wednesday service. So my feeling is that it's become no longer an official FBI practice anymore, but it's still highly encouraged culturally. That is my feeling. How that shift happens, I think it's the face of, I would argue, the face of evangelicalism, I think, changes around that time. And I think what we find today, for example, Christianity today, I would argue, is still an important voice, but I wouldn't say it's the leading voice anymore of they're considered too moderate for many people. So I think that the FBI worship services track that. So Pat Robertson becomes this ascendant individual. Westboro Baptist Church, unfortunately, became this important voice. So I think it tracks along those lines about the changing face, or loudest voices, if you will, of evangelicalism.
Good morning. My name's Kevin Hawkins. I'm a 81 ND grad, and I do some affiliation with the Center for Social Concerns here. I've been a 20-year federal employee, so when you're talking about our federal institutions and what I've found striking is the lack of evolution culturally. I didn't say Pope. The lack of evolution culturally in these institutions, morally in these institutions, is really striking in light of what you're talking about in the book. But there's something that, and I want to say, the way you all have comported yourselves as a panel, how generous you are as colleagues, I find very inspiring, and that respect and appreciation you all have for each other. But to get to my question, finally, you talked about defining white Christian nationalism in a way and you felt the importance of the role of historians in doing that to promote a more inclusive and receptive dialogue. Outside of these forums, what do you all, and this is for the panel, what do you think is the role of the historian in promoting some more receptive and inclusive dialogues about these types of subjects?
Wow, that's a great question. I'll just say one thing. I think for me, it's important to try to dismiss the idea that this was inevitable. I think that helps with conversation as it relates to authority, because I think if you come into a conversation that this is the way that it was, or it always has been, or it was inevitable to get here, you take away human agency. So I think it's important for historians to point out this was not inevitable. There were human actors involved who made certain decisions that got us to this point. And if human actors got us to this point, then it's human actors that maybe can help us correct some of the mistakes. So that's the role I think the historian plays.
Yes. In some ways, our job is difficult because the public conversation asks for sound bites and neat and tidy definitions. And we mess with those, right? And we're going to complicate things, but that's what's so critical right now. And so, every interview I give, I start off with, on white Christian nationalism. It's nothing new, and it means different things to different people. And there is a spectrum of beliefs accounted for, a spectrum of commitments to democracy here. And I really try to focus the conversation around that question of what is the commitment to democracy here, right? Again, so you can be a deeply Christian person. Absolutely. You can act out of your faith in the public sphere. And then I want to know, as a fellow citizen, And how do you feel about democracy? Right, and how does your faith then come up against democracy, and what tensions do you see? And when push comes to shove, because push is coming to shove right now, right? What is your ultimate commitment to democracy, and how do you understand your faith as part of a pluralistic America, or do you not? And this is where things get really slippery. And I think the more precision that we can have in our discourse, the more productive that discourse can be, and we have to create space for deeply religious people with deeply held religious values to participate in our democratic society. And I will tell you that the self-identified, or even not self-identified, ardent Christian nationalists, it is their game plan to erase any distinction. So that if you are a religious person, if you are a Christian person, if you have any Christian values, you are with us, the Christian nationalists, and they are against you, and they have no space for you in their vision of America, right? And that is false. I like to think that is false. And so that has to be made much more plain, because right now the Christian nationalist kind of group's interests, it is their intentional campaign to define the terms of this conversation.
That's a great point. That's a great point.
I don't, amen. And I, both Lerone and Kristin are on the front line and absolutely necessary, doing amazing work. There's an urgency, obviously, to this type of history that I think is unprecedented. And so the more room we can make for historians of this sort, of this talent, is absolutely crucial. For reasons Kristin just said, and Lerone as well. What's brilliant about both works here represented is these are sound bites. They're not sound bites. They are statements of purpose in the moment that are rooted in a certain patience as well, that historians have to display. And this is the patience that Lerone displays in years of sifting through files and archives. Now more than ever, that type of patience is needed. And with that patience comes an understanding of a more complex past that certainly sheds light on the long-standing role of white supremacy in this country. But again, going back to my own comments, and this is a fault of mine, I think, looking for moments, flashes of hope, flashes of contingency and opportunity, and creases of opportunity for a different future. And using the resources of the past to say to people in the present, look, there are precedents here. We can go back. There are ideas that we have in our repertoire, in our country's repertoire, to access, to imagine something better, something different. And that might be, highly optimistic. Again, I'm Ukrainian Canadian. There's no optimism there. But I'm doing my best. And so when I read a book like this, I really crave, where is the pushback? Please give me some. I need that. And I think we also need that today as a society. So.
Amen, Darren. That's right.
Hi, Dr. Martin. Thank you so much.
Where are you? Okay.
Thank you so much for your book. My name's Jack Young. I'm a PhD student here in the history department at Notre Dame. Again, really enjoyed this book, really insightful read. I guess, it seems obviously the specter of Donald Trump is, around this book, right? And you draw connections between Hoover and Ronald Reagan and Donald Trump in the book's conclusion. I guess in my reading, though, I was wondering, is the more analogous figure someone like an Antonin Scalia, right? Somebody who is embedded in the state rather than, electoral politics. Someone who is Catholic yet had great support from evangelicals and was seen as this sort of luminary in the space of the judiciary. And so drawing on those reflections, kind of the conversation we've been having about anti-state statism, does the locus of anti-state statism shift over time in the post-Hoover era, away from the intelligence agencies, other places of government? And if that's the case, if scholars are thinking, if we're thinking about evangelicals in the state, where else should we be looking if we're looking at the history kind of post-Hoover? I mean, is it what parts of the state is in need of more inquiry and analysis in terms of how evangelicals are relating to those parts of government? Thanks.
It's a great question. I think Scalia, I think that's a good person. Maybe this is controversial, but I probably should have mentioned David Duke, because David Duke, I think we forget, he had a good deal of support outside of Louisiana. And I think we forget about his role. And then I know, is it Scalise? Is that who was the, I think he had mentioned at one point in time in his career that he was David Duke without the baggage. So I think that I should have mentioned David Duke. I think he's unfortunately an important figure in this conversation, in addition to Scalia, I think. But I think from the FBI and the Department of Homeland Security's own reports, one place that we should be looking to is law enforcement and the military. I think those are the two entities that we really should consider, not just about evangelicals. I don't want to paint that broad brush, right? But this kind of Christian nationalism. I think that from their own reports that there is a great deal of concern about the deliberate focus on law enforcement and the military for white Christian nationalism. I think those would be two areas, if you want to.
Amen to that. That's the two, yes. Law enforcement and military, absolutely. And like you said, deliberate, organized, and decades long.
Timothy Ertl from nearby Bethel University, just 10 minutes away. And I'm wondering, maybe trying to play the game that John did a little bit, the overlapping possible phrases American exceptionalism and white Christian nationalism. Because if we use the term American exceptionalism, we can go back to the Pilgrims, we can go to Tocqueville. Right. We see different strands. Some are just descriptive, some are more normative, and they're religious, they're political, they're very complex, very intertwined. But it seems to me there's some overlap between this long-standing. I don't think it's a mistake that when the University of Chicago started a new political journal, they dedicated their first issue to American exceptionalism. It's just so deeply rooted in the American psyche. No one can run for national office without claiming some form of American exceptionalism. When Trump claimed that we needed to make America great again, it had fallen off the branch. Hillary Clinton comes back, no, America is great. It isn't an argument. Or both Obama and his first opponent,
McCain.
Mitt Romney, both gave side by side. Romney at the Citadel, so Obama went back to the Air Force Academy, gave a twin address. So this is really deeply rooted. And yet, in reading the American exceptionalism literature, it often does seem very white. And so I wonder what kind of overlap there is between American exceptionalism and white Christian nationalism.
I would love for, Darren's like, don't look at me. I would love for colleagues.
That's what's wrong with this nation, so that's all. So.
Well, no, I think John's question and Kristin's comments have really got me thinking about a new barometer or rubric, and that would be about the commitment to democracy. So when I hear American exceptionalism, I think of, as Darren just mentioned, it's problematic, especially as it relates to foreign relations. I think about America's role in the world and what America should be doing, right? Whereas I think with a white Christian nationalist, I see much more of a America first. We're not concerned about what's happening in the world, right? It's about America and America first. Those other countries, we don't really care about them. So much more of an isolationist. So that is what I see. And John's question and Kristin's responses got me thinking along those lines.
I'm watching Emily family's face here. Did you want to weigh in on this?
I'm thinking a lot right now.
Yeah.
So nothing that's safe for company. But I think this is really, yeah, as I was reading your book, which I loved, thank you. I was wondering about sort of this, so my work on foreign missionaries and the American State Department had me thinking about sort of where is sort of the rest of the world in this conversation, and how much, and you know what, the FBI is thinking about domestic issues, right? But to what extent is sort of the international sort of framing any or all or none of this? We'd love to hear you say more.
No, I think, Hoover really wanted a monopoly as it relates to intelligence. He really wanted to have both domestic and international intelligence. President Truman was deeply concerned about that. He writes in his journal, the FBI is tending towards the Gestapo. We don't want any Gestapo. And so Truman is really influential in taking the Office of Strategic Services and helping to push it towards being the CIA and making this sharp line to say the FBI, you're going to handle domestic issues and the CIA will handle international issues. And I think Matt Sutton's book, for example, really points out the way that the CIA used missionaries, and this is excellent for your work, as in this American exceptionalist ideal and about America, sort of the global cop in some ways, and deploying American ideals. And Matthew Graziano's book does this as well, about ideas about religion and politics and exporting that abroad. So I do see a distinction between American exceptionalism and white Christian nationalism. I think there may be some overlap there, but I think there's a distinction. And I think that this commitment to democracy and America's role in the world, I think, is one place we can see a really stark distinction. I think that.
I would say I really like the question and how you framed it, and the comparison between the MAGA American exceptionalism, if you will, and the Hillary Clinton. And interesting things were happening in 2016. I've actually written on Clinton's civil religion, and the kind of understanding was you got to go positive here, right? Nobody likes negativity. And yet, right, MAGA was all about anger and fear. American carnage, but it was directed outwards. So you were telling your followers, your base, you being Trump, right, telling that version of negativity was the threat is out there, you are the chosen ones, right? And Hillary Clinton's version of civil religion, American exceptionalism, was we are good, but we are flawed. We are flawed, and we need to do better. We need to aspire to be who we are called to be as this great nation, to live into the ideals. Yep. Right? It's kind of the 1619 Project, which is a lot less negative than a lot of conservative critics paint it. It is holding up these ideals. It is very much American exceptionalism, and we can live into this, right? And so I think that there's just really interesting things going on there in terms of America's original sin, and in terms of who has to bear that blame and who is the hero.
And it seems to me that the debates are right now about Ukraine deal with this in some ways, right? About how some politicians position themselves as it relates to whether or not the U.S. should be supporting Ukraine. I think some of it is centered on this American exceptionist ideal, and the way that you just talked about, like who is the enemy and what's going on. So you get some politicians who say, why are we sending money over there when we've got all these horrible problems here in America and it's the American carnage, versus Mike Pence and others who have a different style, I would argue, are saying like peace through strength. We have to do this. I think some of it comes down to different ways that they understand this distinction you just made.
We have time for maybe one or two more questions.
Will Schultz from the University of Chicago. Thanks so much, Professor Martin, for this great book and really rich discussion. I wanted to ask about the kind of conservative ecumenism that Hoover seemed to represent and promote, and to ask you about comparing that to the more liberal form of ecumenism going on at the same time, embodied by, like, the Federal Council of Churches. Is this the same phenomenon, just on two different sides of the political spectrum? You know, a kind of conservative ecumenism and a liberal ecumenism? Or does there seem to be a qualitative difference in the nature of this interfaith cooperation? The interfaith cooperation represented by Hoover and the people around him, and the sort of interfaith cooperation promoted by the FCC. And, you know, I don't have an answer to that myself, but I do wonder if thinking about those potential differences in the kind and nature of ecumenism might perhaps illuminate what makes the white Christian nationalism distinctive and new in this period. Anyway, that's a big and very broad question, but any thoughts you have on that, would love to hear them.
Do you mean in terms of their projects, like what their goal is? Is that what you're getting at, or?
Really, and their goal, their intellectual lineage, the way this kind of ecumenism is actually practiced and lived out, what it looks like, really any element of that.
Yeah, it's a good question, because I mean, I think part of what I was saying about the pushback, what Darren provoked with me, and thinking about the protest aspect, there are many people who are upset about this on theological grounds, right? That we're supposed to be evangelicals and we have a theological commitments that make us peculiar and that make us stand out, right? We believe the importance of being born again. We believe the importance of the Bible. So I think that there is you're right, there is a connection between these groups, that what we've learned from Kristin's book and others is that this commitment to theology, at least for this conservative project, right, is not as stark as we've been told it is or should be. But there's a way that we can be connected around hypermasculinity, authoritarianism, militarism, that can draw us together beyond our theological differences. But I think on the liberal side, we see a similar project, but in terms of not being divided by theology, but connected by our commitments to expanding citizenship, about expanding the franchise. I think there's similarities about the theology not being as important, about salvation or whatever that may mean, but the political projects bringing people together. I think there's a connection there.
Well, at this time, I'd like to give the floor over to the panelists if you may have any kind of closing thoughts or final reflections, to either Darren or Kristin.
No, I
just want to thank everyone for your wonderful questions, and taking the time. It is a complete honor to be here and to have the book discussed in this way. And thank you for having me. I want to thank Madonna for making sure I arrive safely wherever she may be and taking care of me. And Diane, who picked me up from the airport, where we discussed politics on the way here. And just everyone here for your wonderful treatment in hosting me. And knowing where I am, I should say go Fighting Irish tonight, right? So thanks.
Thanks to everyone again for coming, and please join us in the spring. Thank you.